The sound of crystal glasses clinking echoed through the penthouse suite as Wall Street's elite celebrated another record quarter. I stood frozen near the bar, my champagne untouched, as Elliot Warner's voice cut through the ambient chatter. And then she walks in, diploma, still warm from some state school, telling me how to restructure our Asian portfolio. Elliot's perfect smile flashed as his audience leaned in. I mean, can you imagine? Leila here thinks 7 generations of investment banking can be trumped by, what was it again? An algorithm you coded in your apartment? The circle of executives erupted in laughter. My cheeks burned as 30 pairs of eyes turned toward me. The outsider. The nobody who dared to challenge one of New York's financial dynasties. Come on, Leila, tell them about your revolutionary idea. Elliot gestured grandly, his custom Brioni suit catching the light. The one that would have cost our clients $40 million if we'd actually implemented it. I opened my mouth, but no words came. Not because I was wrong, I knew my analysis was solid, but because in that moment, I understood that merit meant nothing in a world built on names, connections, and old money. What I didn't see, couldn't have known then, was the way Marcus Chen, Elliot's right-hand man, wasn't laughing with the others. Instead, his eyes narrowed slightly as he studied his best friend's face, something unreadable passing across his features. 6 months earlier, Ms. Mehta. They're ready for you. I smoothed down my only designer suit, a painfully expensive investment from my first bonus, and followed the assistant through Warner Financial's intimidating glass corridors. Family portraits of the Warners lined the hallway. 3 generations of confident, Harvard-educated men who had built one of the most powerful investment firms on the Eastern Seaboard. The interview panel waited in a conference room overlooking Central Park. 4 impeccably dressed executives with expressions that gave nothing away. I recognized Elliot Warner immediately. His face was plastered across financial magazines and society pages alike. At 38, he had fully taken over the CEO position from his semi-retired father. With a reputation for aggressive growth strategies and a ruthless approach to competition. Leila Mehta, he said, glancing at my resume with what seemed like casual disinterest. Princeton undergrad, Columbia MBA, currently at Blackridge Partners. Tell us why you're here. What followed was the most grueling 90 minutes of my professional life. I defended every career decision, explained every market prediction I'd made, and outlined my vision for expanding Warner Financial's reach in emerging markets. By the end, I was exhausted but confident I'd shown my worth. One last question, said the man sitting beside Elliot, whom I'd learn was Marcus Chen, the firm's chief investment officer. Everyone here has connections. Family legacies. What makes you think you can succeed at Warner without them? I met his gaze directly. Because I've never had the luxury of connections. Everything I've achieved has been through analysis, insight, and outworking everyone else. I don't need a legacy. I'm building my own. A flicker of something, respect perhaps, crossed Marcus's face. Elliot, however, simply closed my file. We'll be in touch. 3 days later, I received the offer. Senior investment strategist at Warner Financial. A position that would nearly double my salary and put me on a path to the upper echelons of finance. I accepted immediately, ignoring the whispers of doubt about why they'd chosen an outsider. My first weeks at Warner were a study in contrasts. The work challenged and excited me. I was given real responsibility over significant portfolios and strategic decisions. But the culture was unlike anything I'd experienced. An invisible web of alliances, family connections, and unspoken rules. Don't take it personally, advised Zoe Bennett, an operations director who became my first friend at the firm. We were having lunch in the company cafeteria, an absurdly elegant space with a Michelin-starred chef. Half these people had their positions reserved before they could walk. You're here on merit, which makes you unusual. Elliot seems to respect my work, at least, I said, picking at my salad. Zoe's expression was carefully neutral. Elliot respects results. Just make sure you deliver them. And I did. Over the next few months, my strategies yielded returns that outperformed expectations. I developed a risk assessment model that caught the attention of several board members. and gradually began to feel that perhaps I could belong here after all. Elliot would stop by my office occasionally, asking questions about my methodology or challenging my assumptions. These conversations were invigorating. He was brilliant, if arrogant, and I started to believe he saw me as a valuable addition to the team. It was during one of these discussions that Marcus Chen first truly noticed me. He had been passing by when Elliot and I were debating the potential impact of regulatory changes in Singapore. "You've done your homework," Marcus said after listening for a few minutes. Unlike Elliot's performative intensity, Marcus had a quiet authority that commanded attention. The son of Taiwanese immigrants who had built a tech empire, he had his own journey of proving himself, though his path had been cushioned by wealth I could scarcely imagine. "She's thorough. I'll give her that," Elliot said, with that charming smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Reminds me of you in the early days." Marcus. Something about the way Marcus studied me made me think he saw through the office dynamics in a way others didn't. "Keep pushing," he said simply, before continuing on his way. That brief exchange marked the beginning of an unexpected alliance. Marcus began including me in strategic meetings I would otherwise have been excluded from. He asked for my input on projects outside my direct responsibility and occasionally shared insights on navigating the firm's political landscape. "Why are you helping me?" I finally asked him one evening, as we were both working late on quarterly projections. Marcus looked up from his screen, his expression unreadable. "Because talent shouldn't be wasted. Even Elliot knows that beneath all the theater. You've been friends a long time? Since boarding school. 15 years old, and he was already exactly who he is now." A faint smile crossed Marcus's face. Brilliant, insufferable, and convinced of his own exceptionalism. Yet you stayed friends. "Complicated histories make for complicated loyalties," he said cryptically. "But enough about Elliot. Tell me more about this risk pattern you've identified in our European holdings." As the months passed, I began to understand the complex relationship between Marcus and Elliot. They were undeniably close, vacationing together, serving as godparents to each other's children. But there was an undercurrent of tension I couldn't quite decipher. Marcus seemed to be the only person who could challenge Elliot without consequences, the only one allowed to puncture the carefully maintained aura of infallibility. What I didn't realize was that this dynamic was about to draw me into its orbit, with consequences none of us could have anticipated. The Asian markets project began innocently enough. Warner Financial was planning a major expansion into emerging markets across Southeast Asia, and I was assigned to develop the risk assessment framework. The more I analyzed the data, however, the more concerned I became about the firm's existing positions in the region. "These leveraged investments in Malaysian infrastructure are dangerously exposed," I told Zoe over coffee one morning. "If the regulatory environment shifts even slightly, we could see massive losses." "Have you taken this to Elliot?" she asked. "Not yet. I'm still compiling the complete analysis." Zoe's expression was grave. "Be careful, Leila. That Malaysian portfolio was Elliot's personal project last year. He won't take kindly to criticism." She was right, but I couldn't ignore what the numbers were telling me. I spent the next week building an algorithmic model that demonstrated not only the risks, but also a potential restructuring strategy that could protect Warner's investments while maintaining growth opportunities. When I finally requested a meeting with Elliot, he seemed amused by my urgency. "The mysterious Ms. Mehta has a revelation," he said, gesturing for me to sit in his cavernous office. "This should be entertaining." I laid out my findings methodically, showing how the data supported my concerns and explaining the algorithm I'd developed to identify similar risk patterns. "So you're saying I made a mistake," he said when I finished, his voice deceptively light. "I'm saying market conditions have changed, and our position needs to adapt accordingly." Elliot leaned back in his chair, studying me with cold calculation. "Interesting perspective from someone who joined us, 5 minutes ago? Tell you what, put together a formal presentation. Next week, board meeting? If you're so confident, convince them." It wasn't until he smiled that I realized I might have just walked into a trap. The next week was a blur of preparation. I refined my analysis, checked and rechecked my data, and rehearsed my presentation until I could deliver it in my sleep. Marcus reviewed my findings, his expression growing more troubled as he examined the patterns I'd identified. "This is solid work, Leila," he said finally. "But you need to understand what you're stepping into. That Malaysian deal wasn't just Elliot's project, it was a joint venture with Richard Warner, his father." My stomach dropped. The very same. Semi-retired but still on the board, and very protective of his legacy. Marcus hesitated. "And of Elliot in his way?" "So you're saying I should back down?" Marcus considered me carefully. "I'm saying be prepared for resistance, and tread carefully around the relationship dynamics." The morning of the board meeting, I found a text message from an unknown number. "Whatever happens today, don't let them see you break." Zizoe's support bolstered my courage as I entered the boardroom, where 12 of the most powerful people in finance sat waiting. Richard Warner occupied the chair at the far end of the table, his presence commanding despite his age. Beside him sat Elliot perfectly at ease while Marcus took his place on Richard's other side. "Ms. Mehta has an alternative perspective on our Asian strategy," Elliot announced, gesturing for me to begin. "The floor is yours, Leila." For 20 minutes, I presented my analysis without interruption. The data was irrefutable, the patterns clear, the risks undeniable. When I outlined my proposed restructuring, I saw several board members nodding thoughtfully. "An impressive analysis," said Vanessa Pearson, the only female board member besides myself in the room. "You've clearly done your homework." "Indeed," Richard Warner said, his voice carrying decades of authority. "But I'm curious about your algorithm. It contradicts the risk assessments of our established analysts. What makes you so certain you're right and they're wrong?" Before I could respond, Elliot cut in. "An excellent question, Father. Ms. Mehta seems to believe her. 6 months at Warner? Gives her greater insight than our combined experience. That's not what The Malaysian Infrastructure Initiative represents a cornerstone of our Asian strategy," Elliot continued smoothly. "Ms. Mehta's proposal would effectively dismantle that foundation based on theoretical risks that our senior team has already evaluated and dismissed." The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly. Board members who had seemed receptive now looked skeptical, exchanging glances that made my confidence waver. "Elliot," Marcus interjected, "I think we should consider Leila's findings more carefully. The algorithm she's developed shows promising applications beyond this specific case." "Always the diplomat, Marcus," Elliot smiled, though something hardened in his eyes. "But this isn't about algorithms. It's about judgment, experience, understanding the human factors that numbers can't capture." For the next 15 minutes, Elliot systematically dismantled my proposal, not by challenging my data, but by questioning my understanding of the region's business culture, political nuances and historical patterns, factors my algorithm couldn't quantify. With each point, the board's support visibly eroded. "Perhaps," Richard Warner said finally, "Ms. Mehta's analysis would benefit from more seasoning. I suggest we table this discussion until she's had time to develop a more comprehensive understanding of the complexities involved." The dismissal was polite but absolute. As the meeting moved to other agenda items, I sat in stunned silence, my carefully prepared counter-arguments unspoken. Afterward, in the hallway, Marcus caught up with me. "That was unfortunate." "That was orchestrated," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. "He never intended to take my concerns seriously." Marcus didn't deny it. "Elliot protects what he believes in. And he believes in that Malaysian venture, even if it puts the firm at risk?" A shadow crossed Marcus's face. "That's the question, isn't it?" He glanced over my shoulder, then lowered his voice. "Don't give up on this, Leila. Just be strategic about your next move." I didn't understand what he meant then, but I would soon enough. In the weeks that followed, I maintained a professional facade while continuing to monitor the Asian markets. Every data point strengthened my conviction that Warner Financial was heading for trouble. But my warnings had been effectively silenced. "You need to let this go," Zoe advised over drinks at a bar far from the office. You made your case, you were overruled. That's business. It's not about being right, I insisted. It's about protecting the firm and our clients from unnecessary risk. Zoe studied me over her martini. Is it, though? Or is it about proving yourself against Elliot Warner? The question hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. There was something personal in this now, a need to vindicate myself against the dismissal I'd suffered. But beneath that was a genuine concern for what would happen if the Malaysian investments collapsed. My reputation at Warner had subtly shifted since the board meeting. Certain executives were cooler toward me, while others seemed to watch me with new interest. Elliot himself maintained a professional courtesy that felt more dangerous than open hostility. It was during this tense period that I first noticed something odd about Marcus's behavior. Twice I spotted him leaving Richard Warner's office looking troubled. Once I overheard him in an intense phone conversation that abruptly ended when he saw me. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Just the usual fires to put out," he replied. But his smile didn't reach his eyes. The real surprise came a month after the board meeting, when Marcus invited me to join him for lunch at a small restaurant several blocks from the office, far enough to ensure privacy. "I've been looking more closely at your Malaysian analysis," he said without preamble once we were seated. "You were right." The vindication I felt was immediately tempered by concern. "How bad is it?" "Worse than you projected. There are regulatory changes coming that will significantly impact those investments. We need to restructure immediately then. If we start now, it's not that simple." Marcus leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There's something you don't know about that Malaysian deal. Something that explains Elliot's defensive response." My pulse quickened. "What?" "I can't tell you, not yet. But I'm working on something that might change the entire situation." He hesitated. "I need you to trust me and to keep monitoring those markets. Document everything. Build an irrefutable case. For what purpose if Elliot won't listen?" Marcus's expression was grim. "Because there may come a time when it's not Elliot's decision anymore." I left that lunch with more questions than answers, but also with a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever game was being played in the upper echelons of Warner Financial, I was now a piece on the board. The invitation to Elliot's quarterly gathering came as a surprise. These exclusive events, held in his Central Park penthouse, were typically reserved for Warner's inner circle and select clients. My inclusion seemed suspiciously like an olive branch. "He's up to something," Zoe warned when I told her. "Elliot doesn't do reconciliation." "Maybe Marcus suggested it," I said, though I doubted even his influence extended that far. Zoe looked skeptical. "Just watch yourself. These aren't casual cocktails. They're performances. And everyone has a role." I spent an embarrassing amount of time deciding what to wear, finally settling on a midnight blue dress that projected confidence without ostentation. When I arrived at Elliot's penthouse, a temple of minimalist luxury with views that made the city seem like a personal fiefdom, I was immediately struck by the composition of the guest list. This wasn't just Warner's elite. It included partners from rival firms, financial journalists, and several regulatory officials. "Leila, you made it." Elliot materialized beside me, playing the gracious host with practiced ease. "Let me introduce you around. Everyone's been curious about our newest rising star." For the next hour, he guided me through the room, making introductions that seemed calculated to emphasize my junior status while simultaneously claiming credit for discovering me. It was a masterful display of social maneuvering, positioning himself as my benevolent patron. "And of course you know Marcus," he said finally, bringing me face to face with the one person I'd been hoping to speak with all evening. "Ms. Mehta." Marcus nodded formally, though his eyes conveyed a different message. "I trust you're enjoying the event?" "Immensely," I lied. "Elliot has been introducing me to everyone who matters." "That's his specialty," Marcus replied. "Knowing who matters and who doesn't." Something in his tone caught Elliot's attention. 20 years of friendship, and he still disapproves of my networking tactics. He laughed, throwing an arm around Marcus's shoulders. "The moral compass of Warner Financial, ladies and gentlemen." Someone has to be, Marcus said lightly, though I sensed tension beneath the banter. Elliot's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Speaking of morals, have you shared your thoughts on the Peterson acquisition? Leila here might benefit from your perspective. What followed was a subtle but unmistakable shift in the conversation, as Elliot began highlighting instances where Marcus's cautious approach had nearly cost the firm major opportunities. Each anecdote was framed as good-natured ribbing between friends, but the underlying message was clear. Marcus was too hesitant, too constrained by ethical considerations. Remember Singapore 2019? Elliot said to the small group that had gathered around us. Marcus nearly walked away from the table over some technical disclosure issue. Compliance violation, Marcus corrected mildly, which would have resulted in significant penalties. Which we could have absorbed in our sleep, given the profits from that deal, Elliot countered. Sometimes you have to know which rules matter and which are just guidelines. I watched this exchange with growing unease, recognizing it as a demonstration meant partly for my benefit. Elliot was establishing the hierarchy, reminding me and everyone present of who ultimately made the decisions at Warner Financial. When Marcus was called away by another guest, Elliot turned his full attention to me. How are you settling in, Leila? Any lingering concerns about our Asian strategy? The directness of the question caught me off guard. I continue to monitor the situation, I said carefully. The data remains concerning. Yes, the data. Elliot's smile was indulgent. You know, Richard, my father has a saying about analysts who fall in love with their models. Would you like to hear it? Before I could respond, he launched into what became the hook scene, the public mockery of my work, my background, my very presence at Warner Financial. Each barb was delivered with such practiced charm that many guests seemed unsure whether to be uncomfortable or amused, ultimately settling on the latter as the safer option. I stood frozen, acutely aware that how I responded in this moment would define my future at the firm. Fighting back tears of humiliation and rage, I forced myself to maintain eye contact with Elliot, refusing to provide the emotional breakdown that would complete his victory. What I didn't see, couldn't have seen through the haze of my own emotions, was Marcus Chen's face as he returned to the group, the way his expression shifted from confusion to cold anger as he registered what was happening. I didn't notice how he slipped away from the gathering shortly afterward, or how he made a brief phone call from Elliot's home office. All I knew was that I had been publicly eviscerated by one of the most powerful men in finance, and that my carefully constructed professional identity lay in ruins around me. The morning after Elliot's party, I seriously considered not returning to Warner Financial. The humiliation was still raw, the memory of those laughing faces enough to make me physically ill. But beneath the pain was a stubborn core of defiance. I had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to be driven away by calculated cruelty. I arrived at the office early, head held high despite the whispers that followed me through the corridors. By mid-morning, the story of Elliot's takedown had spread throughout the firm, elevated to corporate legend status. I ignored the sidelong glances and focused rigidly on my work, analyzing the latest data from the Malaysian markets with grim determination. The knock on my office door came just before noon. "Do you have a minute?" Marcus asked, closing the door behind him without waiting for my response. I straightened papers that didn't need straightening. "If this is about last night, it's about the Malaysian investments," he interrupted. "And yes, indirectly, about last night." Something in his tone made me look up. Marcus's usual composed demeanor had been replaced by a contained intensity I'd never seen before. "What's happened?" "The regulatory changes we anticipated are coming sooner than expected. The Indonesian government announced new capital control policies this morning that will cascade throughout the region." My stomach dropped. "Our exposure? Significant. But that's not why I'm here." He placed a flash drive on my desk. "This contains documents you need to review. Not here. Not on any Warner system." I stared at the small device. "What am I looking at?" Marcus hesitated, choosing his words with obvious care. "Evidence that the Malaysian investments weren't just strategically unsound, They were ethically compromised. What does that mean? It means Elliot knew the risks. He knew them before you ever presented your analysis, and he proceeded anyway because the short-term gains would secure his position with the board. Marcus's expression hardened, and because certain parties stood to benefit personally from those investments, regardless of the eventual fallout for our clients. The implication was staggering. Are you talking about fraud? I'm talking about a pattern of decisions that prioritize certain interests over fiduciary responsibility. His careful phrasing told me everything I needed to know about the seriousness of what he was sharing. Review the files. Then we'll talk about next steps. After he left, I sat staring at the flash drive for a long moment, understanding that whatever it contained would irrevocably change my relationship with Warner Financial and with Elliot Warner himself. That evening, in my apartment, I plugged the drive into my personal laptop and began reviewing the documents. What unfolded before me was a meticulous record of internal communications, financial transfers, and meeting minutes that painted a disturbing picture of the Malaysian infrastructure initiative. Elliot had indeed been aware of the regulatory risks. A private analysis commissioned months before my presentation had outlined them in detail. Yet he had not only proceeded with the investments, but had increased Warner's exposure while simultaneously helping certain board members, including his father, shield their personal holdings from the same risks. Most damning were the records of offshore accounts linked to shell companies that had received consulting fees in connection with the Malaysian projects, companies that appeared to be connected to both Warner executives and Malaysian officials who had fast-tracked approval processes. Hands were shaking by the time I finished reading. This wasn't just bad business judgment. It was potentially criminal misconduct that put clients' investments at risk while enriching insiders. I called Marcus immediately. Where did you get these files? I've had concerns about certain practices for some time, he said carefully. I've been quietly documenting them. Why show me this now? There was a pause. Because what happened last night wasn't just about your analysis or even about you. It was about silencing questions that threaten a system Elliot has carefully constructed. You deserve to know what you're really up against. So this is what? A warning? Get out while I can? No, Leila. It's an opportunity for both of us. The next morning, Marcus and I met at a cafe several blocks from the office. The plan we formulated was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. We would take our concerns and the evidence directly to Vanessa Pearson, the board member who had shown interest in my analysis and who, Marcus informed me, had been quietly pushing for greater oversight of executive decisions. She's been looking for leverage to challenge some of Richard and Elliot's more autonomous choices, Marcus explained. This gives her that leverage. Why not go to the authorities? I asked, because this needs to be handled internally first, for the sake of the firm and its clients. If this becomes a public scandal, thousands of innocent people lose their investments. And if Vanessa doesn't act on the information, Marcus's expression was grim. Then we have decisions to make, but I believe she will. We agreed to approach her separately to avoid raising suspicions. Marcus would speak with her first, laying the groundwork, and I would follow with the technical analysis that supported the documentation. What we didn't anticipate was how quickly events would accelerate once set in motion. The emergency board meeting was called just 3 days later. I received the notification with a mixture of dread and vindication. This was happening, but I had no idea how it would end. As I made my way to the conference room, Zoe caught up with me in the corridor. "Something big is happening," she whispered. "Elliot is on a warpath, and Richard Warner just arrived looking like he's about to have a stroke. Have you seen Marcus?" "In with Vanessa Pearson since dawn." "Leila, what's going on?" I couldn't risk telling her, not yet. "I'll fill you in later." "Wish me luck." The tension in the boardroom was palpable. Richard Warner occupied his usual seat at the head of the table, his face ashen. Elliot stood by the window, his posture rigid with barely contained fury. Marcus sat beside Vanessa Pearson, his expression carefully neutral. Other board members fidgeted uncomfortably, clearly aware that something significant was unfolding but uncertain of the details. I took my assigned seat, feeling Elliot's cold gaze track my movement. "Now that we're all present," Vanessa began, her voice steady, "I've called this emergency meeting to address serious concerns about our Malaysian infrastructure investments and related governance issues." "This is completely inappropriate," Richard interrupted. Board protocol requires us to act when presented with evidence of potential misconduct," Vanessa countered firmly. "The documentation Mr. Chen and Ms. Mehta have provided warrants immediate attention." A murmur ran through the room as heads turned toward Marcus and me. Elliot's expression darkened further. "Marcus," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "perhaps you'd like to explain to everyone what you think you're doing." Marcus met his friend's gaze unflinchingly. "I'm doing what should have been done months ago. The Malaysian investments were compromised from the beginning, Elliot. You knew the risks, you hid them from the board, and you structured the deals to protect certain interests at the expense of others." "That's a serious accusation," Richard Warner said, color returning to his face in angry splotches. "It is," Marcus agreed, "and it's supported by extensive documentation, which all of you now have in the files before you." Ms. Mehta identified the fundamental problems months ago and was systematically undermined for doing so. All eyes turned to me. I took a deep breath and opened my laptop, projecting a series of graphs onto the main screen. My original analysis identified regulatory vulnerabilities in our Malaysian positions, I began, finding strength in the familiar territory of data. What I didn't know then was that these risks had already been identified internally and deliberately obscured. For the next 20 minutes, I walked the board through the evidence, methodically connecting the documentation Marcus had gathered with the market analysis I had developed. As I spoke, I watched the expressions around the table shift from skepticism to concern to outright alarm. Elliot remained silent throughout my presentation, his eyes never leaving my face. It wasn't until I finished that he finally pushed himself away from the window. "An impressive performance," he said, clapping slowly. "Really, the coordination between you two is remarkable. How long have you been planning this little coup?" "This isn't a coup, Elliot," Marcus said quietly. "It's accountability." "Is that what you're calling betrayal these days?" Elliot's smile was chilling. 20 years of friendship and you go behind my back with— What exactly? Selective interpretations of complex business decisions? Out-of-context communications? "The evidence speaks for itself," Vanessa interjected. "Does it?" Elliot turned to the rest of the board. "What you're seeing is a deliberate mischaracterization of legitimate business strategies by two individuals with personal agendas. Marcus has always resented my leadership position, and Ms. Mehta, well, we all witnessed her embarrassing performance at the last board meeting. This is revenge, plain and simple." "Elliot," Richard Warner's voice cut through the tension. "Enough. The documentation is concerning. We need to address these issues substantively, not with personal attacks." The surprise on Elliot's face at his father's words was quickly masked, but not before I caught it. He hadn't expected Richard to waver. "Of course, father," he recovered smoothly. "I welcome a thorough examination of all my decisions. In the meantime, however, I believe Mr. Chen's position at this firm is untenable given his actions." "As for Ms. Mehta, you don't have that authority," Vanessa interrupted. "Not anymore. Given the nature of these allegations, the board will be implementing temporary management changes pending a complete investigation." The color drained from Elliot's face. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious," Vanessa replied, nodding to the corporate counsel who had silently entered the room. "The necessary documentation has been prepared. Effective immediately, you are on administrative leave." The days following the emergency board meeting passed in a blur of depositions, audits, and tense strategy sessions. Warner Financial became a pressure cooker of competing loyalties and self-preservation instincts as the full extent of the Malaysian situation came to light. I maintained a low profile, continuing my work while providing information to the internal investigation as requested. Marcus, meanwhile, was thrust into a temporary leadership role alongside Vanessa Pearson, working to contain the damage and reassure clients. Elliot had retreated to his penthouse, communicating only through his legal team. Richard Warner, in a surprising turn, had recused himself from all decisions related to the investigation, citing potential conflicts of interest, a tacit acknowledgement that his own conduct might not withstand scrutiny. It was nearly 2 weeks after the board meeting when I received the text message from Marcus. "He wants to meet. Tonight. Both of us." No explanation was needed. He could only be Elliot. I replied with a single question mark. Neutral territory. "The Hamilton Club, private dining room, 8 p.m. Your choice, but I'm going." The Hamilton Club was old New York money, a discreet establishment where the city's power brokers had conducted business for generations. I had never set foot inside, but I knew its reputation for absolute privacy. I stared at my phone for a long moment before responding. "I'll be there." The club was exactly as I had imagined. Dark wood, hushed conversations, deferential staff who seemed to materialize and vanish with practiced invisibility. I was escorted through a series of increasingly exclusive spaces until I reached a private dining room where Marcus and Elliot waited. Elliot sat at the head of a table set for 3, a glass of scotch in his hand. He looked simultaneously diminished and dangerous, like a predator backed into a corner. Marcus stood by the window, his posture tense. "Ms. Mehta," Elliot greeted me with exaggerated formality. "Thank you for joining us for this reunion." I took the seat opposite Marcus, declining the offered drink with a shake of my head. "Why are we here, Elliot?" "Straight to business. I've always appreciated that about you." He swirled his scotch thoughtfully. "We're here because despite recent unpleasantness, we still have mutual interests." "I'm struggling to identify them," I replied. "Survival," he said simply. "The continued existence of Warner Financial as we know it." Marcus finally joined us at the table. "The firm will survive, Elliot. The question is in what form and under whose leadership." "That's precisely my point." Elliot leaned forward. "The 3 of us right now have the power to determine that outcome. Once the authorities become involved, which they inevitably will if this continues, that control vanishes." A chill ran through me. "Are you proposing some kind of cover-up?" "I'm proposing a resolution that serves everyone's interests." Elliot's voice was measured, reasonable. "A restructuring of the Malaysian investments, as you originally suggested. A modification of certain governance practices. A transitional leadership arrangement." "And in exchange?" Marcus asked. "The internal investigation concludes without referrals to regulatory agencies. Certain documentations are recognized as being open to interpretation rather than definitive evidence of misconduct." The offer hung in the air between us. I looked at Marcus, trying to read his reaction, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "Why would we consider this?" I finally asked. Elliot's smile was thin. "Because a public scandal destroys more than just me, Leila. It damages every career associated with Warner, including yours. It decimates client portfolios. It ends the firm my family built over 3 generations. A firm you were willing to put at risk," Marcus pointed out. "I made calculated decisions to ensure our competitive position," Elliot countered. "Perhaps I stepped over certain lines. But don't pretend this industry operates within neat ethical boundaries, Marcus. We both know better." For a moment, I could see the weight of their long friendship in the way they regarded each other. The shared history, the complex bonds of loyalty and competition that had defined their relationship. "There's something else you should know," Elliot continued after a pause. "My father has offered to assume responsibility for certain decisions regarding the Malaysian investments. His health is failing, cancer stage 4. Few people know. The revelation landed like a stone. Richard Warner, the patriarch of the dynasty, offering himself as a sacrifice to protect his son and the family legacy. That's why he recused himself, Marcus said quietly. Elliot nodded. He has months at most. He's prepared to sign statements taking responsibility for overriding compliance concerns. His reputation in exchange for the firm's future, and mine. I felt physically ill at the calculated nature of this maneuver, using a dying man's final act to shield the truly responsible parties. Yet I could see how effective it would be, how neatly it would resolve the crisis while preserving the Warner name. And if we refuse? I asked. Elliot's expression hardened. Then I burn it all down. Every questionable decision Marcus has ever been party to, and there are many, despite his moral posturing. Every piece of internal information that could damage our clients and competitors. I'll ensure that when Warner Financial falls, it's a cataclysm that touches everyone. You'd destroy your own family's legacy out of spite? Marcus asked incredulously. I'd ensure that righteous betrayal has consequences, Elliot corrected. So what will it be? A controlled restructuring that preserves the firm or mutually assured destruction? The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at Marcus, seeing the conflict in his eyes as he weighed decades of friendship and loyalty against the clear ethical breach before us. You miscalculated, I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt. Again, Elliot's eyes narrowed. Excuse me? You assumed this is still about careers and reputations and damage control? I continued. It's not. It's about something much simpler now. And what's that, Ms. Mehta? The truth. I stood up slowly. You mocked me in front of your elite business circle because I dared to challenge you with facts. You tried to destroy my professional credibility to protect yourself. And now you're trying to manipulate us with threats and a grotesque plan to use your dying father as a shield. Careful, Elliot warned, but I was beyond caution now. No, you be careful. The documentation doesn't just exist in the files Marcus provided. I've created backups. Secure, distributed backups that will automatically be delivered to the SEC, the Justice Department, and the financial press if anything happens to either of us. Elliot's face paled slightly. You're bluffing, am I? You taught me an important lesson, Elliot. Merit isn't enough in your world. You need protection, insurance, so I created some. Marcus was watching me with a mixture of surprise and what might have been admiration. She's right, Elliot. It's over, Marcus. Elliot's voice had a pleading quality I'd never heard before. 20 years. That has to count for something. It does, Marcus said quietly. It's why I gave you the chance to stop this yourself, long before it reached this point. You chose not to listen. Elliot's facade finally cracked. You self-righteous bastard. You think you'll fare better once they start digging? You signed off on half those Malaysian deals. Under false pretenses with manipulated data, Marcus replied. Which is documented in the records you didn't know I was keeping. Why? Elliot asked, his voice hollow. Why turn on me now after all this time? Marcus considered the question carefully. Because there's a difference between bending rules and breaking core principles. You crossed that line, and you were willing to sacrifice innocent people to protect yourself. He paused. Including Leila, whose only crime was being right when you needed her to be wrong. The three of us sat in silence as the full weight of the situation settled over us. Everything was about to change. The firm, our careers, the carefully constructed world that Elliot Warner had ruled. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. I won't beg, Elliot said finally. No one asked you to, I replied. All anyone asked was that you be accountable for your actions. He laughed bitterly. Accountability. Such a convenient concept when it applies to others. He drained his scotch and stood. I'll see you both at the reckoning. After he left, Marcus and I remained, the tension slowly ebbing from the room. Did you really create those backups? Marcus asked after a while. I met his gaze steadily. Would you have agreed to his proposal if I hadn't? He considered the question. I'd like to think not. But 20 years is a long time to share someone's life. It is, I acknowledged. Thank you for choosing the truth, Marcus smiled faintly. Thank you for forcing the choice. 6 months later, the new offices of Chen Mehta Strategic Advisors overlooked Bryant Park, a deliberately modest space compared to the towering glass monument of Warner Financial. Our client list was selective, companies and funds committed to both profitability and ethical governance, and growing steadily as our reputation for integrity spread through the industry. I finished reviewing a potential client's portfolio and stepped into Marcus's office, where he was on a call. He gestured for me to wait as he wrapped up the conversation. "That was Vanessa," he said after hanging up. "The SEC has finalized the settlement. Warner Financial will survive, but with a completely restructured board and executive team." "And Elliot?" "Barred from executive positions in financial institutions for 5 years, plus personal penalties. He kept his freedom, which is more than many expected." I nodded, processing the news. The Malaysian investments had been restructured according to my original proposal, minimizing but not eliminating the losses. Warner clients had been protected from the worst of the fallout, though the firm's reputation had suffered significant damage. Richard Warner had died 3 months earlier. His final public statement, a carefully worded acknowledgement of oversight failures that managed to accept responsibility without admitting specific wrongdoing. His funeral had been attended by New York's financial and social elite, a celebration of his legacy that diplomatically avoided mention of how that legacy had ended. "Any regrets?" Marcus asked, studying my expression. I considered the question seriously. "About leaving Warner?" "No, about how it all unfolded?" I hesitated. "I wish there had been another way. Less collateral damage." "That's the thing about systems built on compromised foundations," Marcus said. "They rarely come down neatly." My phone buzzed with a text message from Zoe, who had joined our firm as operations director last month. "Turn on CNB News now." I reached for the remote, switching on the television mounted on Marcus's wall. Elliot Warner's face filled the screen as he exited a downtown building, surrounded by reporters. "Mr. Warner, any comment on the SEC settlement?" a journalist called out. Elliot stopped, adjusting his tie, a gesture so familiar it sent a chill through me. "The settlement speaks for itself," he said smoothly. "I continue to maintain that many of the allegations were exaggerated or taken out of context, but I respect the regulatory process." "Will you return to finance after the 5-year restriction ends?" another reporter asked. Elliot's smile was practiced, perfect. "America loves a comeback story. But for now, I'm focused on my new technology ventures. The future lies in disruption, not tradition." The camera followed him as he slid into a waiting car, the same confident swagger evident despite everything that had happened. I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach. "He's already repositioning himself," I said quietly. "Creating a narrative where he's the bold innovator constrained by outdated systems." "And that surprises you?" Marcus asked. "No," I admitted. "Just disappoints me." Marcus turned off the television. "People like Elliot don't change, Leila. They adapt. They survive. It's what makes them dangerous, and sometimes brilliant." "And people like us?" He smiled, gesturing to the office around us. "We build something better, something that lasts because it doesn't require constant deception to maintain." I wasn't entirely convinced. The financial world was still dominated by the Elliots, the powerful figures who bent rules and crafted realities to suit their purposes. Our small firm, however principled, was a drop in that ocean. "You're thinking we're just tilting at windmills," Marcus observed, reading my expression. "The thought has crossed my mind." "Then let me show you something." He opened his laptop, pulling up a graph I hadn't seen before. "This tracks the performance of firms with strong ethical governance against those with documented compliance issues." The lines told a clear story. Over time, the ethical firms consistently outperformed their compromised counterparts. "The advantage isn't immediate," Marcus explained. "It builds slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. But eventually, the weight of integrity creates a foundation that withstands market shocks better than any house of cards, no matter how cleverly constructed." As I studied the data, I felt something shift inside me, not a dramatic revelation, but a quiet reinforcement of the path we had chosen. Perhaps we weren't changing the world overnight, but we were contributing to a slower, more sustainable transformation. My phone buzzed again with another text from Zoe. "Client meeting in 10, the Singapore group." "Duty calls," I said, straightening up. "The Singaporeans are here to discuss their sustainable infrastructure fund." Marcus nodded. The irony doesn't escape me. Another Asian infrastructure project, but this time, we do it right. As I walked back to my office to gather my materials for the meeting, I passed the framed article that hung in our reception area. Financial Times piece titled, "The Warner Reckoning: How Two Insiders Exposed a System of Financial Manipulation." The subtitle read, "Chen and Mehta's Stand for Integrity Triggers Industry-Wide Examination of Governance Practices." I paused before it, remembering the night at Elliot's penthouse when he had mocked me in front of his elite business circle. How small and powerless I had felt in that moment. How far we had come since then. The truth hadn't won easily or completely. Elliot Warner was already rebuilding his life and career, using his connections and charm to create new opportunities. The financial system still favored the bold and sometimes unscrupulous. The fight for integrity would never truly end. But standing in the offices of the firm Marcus and I had built, a firm founded on the principle that merit and ethics could coexist with success, I felt something Elliot Warner, for all his wealth and influence, would never truly know. The quiet power of living without contradiction, of success achieved without compromise. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was a beginning, and in a world of Elliot Warners, beginnings mattered.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.